Good morning. It is January 13th, 2021. We are continuing a series that started last year in regards to how attorneys, law enforcement can come together, at least in the state of Texas, to approach, discuss, and look for solutions in regards to our communities and the interactions between law enforcement and citizens. We have the African American lawyer section of the State Bar of Texas, and we have the Texas Municipal Police Association, the DPS Officers Association, and the Houston Police Officers Association on this call. However, there have been numerous other law enforcement entities that have taken time and been a part and are also a part of these goings on, even though they are not present today from the Dallas area and beyond in the state of Texas. We wanted to start this viewing to let you know that in the state of Texas, that we are keenly aware, and I have had the fortunate opportunity prior to starting this Facebook Live to speak with Clay Taylor, and he assured me that there is definite coordination when it comes to having our capital in Austin, Texas, properly secured and defended for the sake of all the citizens in the state of Texas and its lawmakers. Clay, if you want to say anything else, the floor is open to you, but I thought that was a pretty succinct statement.
I think you covered it all. I would just tell the people that have business at the Capitol to be patient. I know the PIO for DPS put out last week to the public that the north entrance was the only entrance that was going to be open for a couple of reasons. Mainly, to anybody entering the Capitol has to have a COVID test. It's one of those instant 15-minute results tests. So in order to get compliance out of everybody, that everybody has to go through the north entrance. Everything else is going to be locked and inaccessible. But you probably noticed, as I did, that there's an increased amount of security. That was before what took place last week at the U.S. Capitol. But certainly the governor has reached out to the director, and he's happy to provide that.
Excellent. And as citizens of the state, we certainly want to preserve our capital. It gives us a place to share thoughts, perspectives, and ideas. And so
Absolutely.
We do not want to disrupt that process. It happens for us every odd year for 140 days. As you mentioned, Clay, it started yesterday.
Yes.
With that, we want to resume where we left off last week, and that was with the Sunset Commission's recommendations with respect to TCOLE, which is the agency that, for lack of a better term, oversees all law enforcement certifications. Is that correct, Kevin, in my characterization?
No, that's correct. They license all of our peace officers. They set the training standards for all of our peace officers, and they are the ones who oversee the actual agencies and make sure that the agencies have met the criteria that are necessary to form a law enforcement agency to start with.
And every so often, for those that don't know, state agencies come under a review. This review is done by the Sunset Commission, where they look at aspects of the state agency and then make recommendations, suggestions, so on and so forth. And this process occurs for all state agencies in the state of Texas.
Yes.
You were going to say something, and I know we started on the first recommendation last week.
I think we got through 1, 2, and 3, didn't we?
Okay.
No, we were actually supposed to talk about 3. We saved 3 for today to really dig into it, dealing with the background checks, the training, because that we talked about number 1, and in talking about number 1, we couldn't help but loop in number 2, because part of the reason why number 1 is an issue is because of the IT infrastructure, which is what we were talking about.
So
And
Nick,
so,
can you,
Uh-huh.
can you tell us please what 1 and 2 are?
sure. Let me go back. So
Thank
issue number 1 was, give me 1 second because I have it up on issue 3 with my questions. So issue number 1 was the recommendation that Texas' approach to regulating law enforcement is ineffective. We talked about the blue ribbon panel. We talked about some of the changes that we've talked about in our prior conversations. And some of the issues that we identified was that you gave us some background on the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement. And we talked about the recommendation that they made in administering the law enforcement agency. And then we talked about the IT roadblocks that are there. And that was issue number 2, that the commission does not follow the best contracting policies for its IT services. So that was in our discussion from last week.
And 3 today would be?
3, issue number 3 is a good one. And this is something that we actually have already talked about a couple of times, but it's worth kind of highlighting here. And the issue was that key elements of TCOLE statute and procedures do not conform to common licensing and regulatory standards. So some of the issues that were identified were the problems with background checks, the inconsistency with background checks. There was a recommendation to conduct fingerprints that would allow fingerprint-based criminal background checks of all applicants and licensees for law enforcement agencies. They also talked about issuing the authority for TCOLE to issue subpoenas for investigative records, and also directing TCOLE to adopt rules that would comply with statutory requirements to establish a risk-based approach to audits. And so I think the two top ones that we were talking about are focused on more the criminal background checks of applicants and the roadblocks or any kind of barriers where they were talking about with respect to the hiring and how they create some of these barriers. And I think that's kind of where we wanted to talk about today.
Right. And Kevin, I know just for some of this background to be set up, if I'm not mistaken, Texas has 2,700 different law enforcement entities across the state.
Over 2,700 agencies that currently employ law enforcement officers.
Correct. So the uniformity of hiring can be very different given who is the head person of these agencies, correct? So
that's true, but I mean there are standards in place. There are provisions that when a law enforcement agency wants to hire an officer, there's a licensing process. If the officer hasn't been through a licensing process, then that has to be part of that consideration. But the agency is already required, and Doug or Clay may help me out here, but there is a criminal background investigation. There is a background investigation in general that's done almost universally, but there are requirements that TCOLE has that says the agency must do A, B, C, and D and put all that information into a file and keep it at that agency so that when TCOLE comes along and does an audit, they get to look at it. All the agency has to send into the state of Texas is an L1, which is, I'm pretty sure it's the L1 that says, hey, we've hired this individual. There is not a process whereby the state actually looks at all those records right up front. But you also have to go back a little bit. People can go to a police academy without being sponsored by a law enforcement agency. Just about every college and university and COG, Council of Governments, has their own police academy, law enforcement academy across the state of Texas. And you can individually, Steve, you could go down tomorrow and pay your money and enroll and go through an academy. The academy also has a duty to do certain background investigations, but it's not the same that the agency has to go through.
Right.
I think what the commission is saying is that there should be more in-depth statewide requirements, and that everything should be funneled through the Commission on Law Enforcement. And I will point out yet again, TCOLE does not have the resources to do that at present.
So let me
ask before you go there,
ahead.
Steve. One of the questions that we have, and that kind of came up when we first started our conversations, me and Doug, I think were the main talkers on this, was the inconsistency though. between doing the background checks. And I think that's where the problem is, and kind of what the recommendation and the issue really highlights is that it's inconsistent. So
Not
while
on
it
the
is being
criminal,
done,
not on the criminal
Not on
background.
criminal,
The criminal
So not on the-
background has to be run through NCIC, TCIT, has to go in the file, so on and so forth. Now, whether or not you can commission somebody who has a criminal history on their record, that is governed by state law. But the rest of the background, the rest of it is not regulated. So going back and talking to their former employers, going back and looking at their college transcripts, their high school transcripts, all that, talking to their references and their references, that is where all the inconsistencies come in. I guarantee you DPS goes to the nth degree to investigate anybody who applies there. So does Houston. And I don't want to call out any small agencies, but if not any town in Texas that employs 3 officers, they are probably not putting the same level of effort into it.
Right.
And I think that's kind of
I would
where,
just add to that,
Go
it
ahead.
probably comes down to financial ability to do that. It's costly.
Right. So what are the main points of variation that make a difference when it comes to hiring, whether you're in a 4-person agency or 400 person agency? Because again, it sounded like to me that the criminal's taken care of and a couple other primary issues are looked at. What are those secondary, tertiary, those things lower in the list that you, a seasoned veteran law enforcement, go, ooh, if you look at number 5 here, because, let's, again, I always go back to sports. We understand those things very well. If you're scouting somebody who you're going to draft, you can say the measurables are very simple. He's 6'3", he's 240, he runs this, here's his numbers for the drills. But what is it that makes him draftable versus the next other 2 people you may consider in that slot that makes him the all-pro versus a bust or someone?
I'll give you an example.
Okay.
I'll give you an example of that. You've got a guy coming straight out of college that's never worked police work before and in a small town. Then you've got a guy that may have gotten fired by Houston Police Department, but he's had 6 years of training with one of the best organizations in the nation. Which one are you going to pick? Even though he may have got fired from here from doing something silly, do you take the guy that's already been trained and has the experience, or do you take that rookie that's never done police work ever?
I think it depends on what he was fired for. And I think because that's a relevant piece of information that you really
Exactly.
need.
Yeah, for you and me, that's correct. I would want to look at that. But some agencies, all they see is, hey, we're getting a highly trained guy. Obviously, if he's fired for something like excessive force or something like that, yes, they're probably not going to pick him. But there's outside things people get fired for every day that they're going to go, I don't care about that. Bring him on over.
Right, but if you're a small agency that doesn't have the resources, you're not getting the same percentage of applicants that are coming your way. And if you've got a 6-year veteran who comes in there and says, I want a job, you're a lot more likely to take a chance to take a flyer on that individual, even if they have been fired from a prior job, simply because you don't have any better options.
Correct.
And you don't have to train him. He's already got the license, and he's ready to go to work.
Yep.
So, but do we think that by doing it in that manner, I mean, what is something that can be done though to help with the selection process? Because if they have been fired for excessive force or there's an issue, and then you bring them on to a new force, that just continues to create a problem.
Well, I'll say this. It does not necessarily continue to create a problem. It gives the possibility of the problem to continue. Because again, you can right the wrong. You can recognize that you lost your opportunity, which forced you to go to a different opportunity. And I say that people haven't improved their actions after that fact, And so, Doug, you're right.
I got an example of that. Our chief has a no tolerance policy if you don't do a DWI. You stop somebody for DWI, you get them an Uber, send them home, and you tow their car. If you do that here, you get fired. But we've had probably 8 guys fired for just ignoring DWIs, maybe more. So does that make them a bad policeman because they did it a different way? No, not necessarily. And guess who picked those up? One of our local constables. And they said, keep firing people for that because we'll take every single one of them. I mean, does it mean they're bad policemen? Not at all. Not at all. But that's the chief's pet peeve. So therefore, we're going to get rid of them here. But somebody else is going to pick them up because you've got a well-trained officer that knows what he's doing and doesn't have a problem with helping people out if they need it. And
Right. And Doug, I think that is kind of a universal decision, with alcohol. I think where it becomes problematic if it deals with ethnic relations.
Right.
Because that's going to be the hot spot that's going to be difficult for different communities, or even passers through the community heading from Austin to Houston, and I go through said township, and you have someone who was fired because of that type of scenario that stopped Steve-O on 290, and all of a sudden I got to pull out hey, I've worked for TMPA. I'm going to go see the president of the Houston Police Association. So if you really want to stop me, look and see why I'm not there on time. And I'm telling you what, my phone location is on. So, I think it is the level of sensitivity, but it's also the action. You can get, and again, back to the sports analogy, I can get 15-yard unsportsmanlike personal foul because I taunted you after making a good catch. But if I get an unsportsmanlike because I lead with the crown of my helmet, I'm out of the game because targeting is completely different than me talking trash after I believe I made a good play against you. And
That's
I
a good
think
analogy.
disseminating between which personal offense you've committed as a law enforcement officer and to be then reestablished within the system, I think is where you get, because you kept that same mentality throughout.
And that Steve kind of goes along, I guess, with your question where you said, what are the points? Is there like a point system or a value that you could give to this point versus this point so that it makes it a consistent factor with your hiring between the different agencies?
Yeah, because you're the subject matter expert. You know what makes a good officer versus not so good. And you're saying someone who doesn't prosecute a DWI is still a good officer in general. But someone who has a bias against a certain ethnicity or religious background, that's more likely to become an issue wherever they are, as opposed to the decision-making of driving while intoxicated, allegedly. Of course, the lawyers are going to say, we got to take and see what's going on. But again, the decision that was made at the stop, right, by that officer or law enforcement personnel, that's going to be a judgment call that I think, like you said, the constable says, no problem, give them to me. But again, if I know I'm a Black law enforcement officer that doesn't like white people, and now I have the opportunity, I've done well, but I tell you what, if I see somebody looks like Doug or Kevin or Clay, I got you. I'm going to prosecute you to the fullest extent. Now, I may say I'm in the purviews and the parameters of everything I can do, but you're getting maximum every time I get somebody like yourself. That can be an issue.
Yes.
Without a doubt. And so what mechanisms, as you're looking at law enforcement, moving between agencies or creating a standardization, as Sunset has displayed, that you as seasoned veterans and understand the mindset of law enforcement that the general public does not, that we do not. What do you want to use as a standardized listing or oh my goodness, look at this list before you hire the person, that we can standardize from Muleshoe, as we've used before, all the way up to Houston.
Right.
I apologize. I lost my internet connection there for a little while, so I missed part of this conversation. But some of this we've talked about, Steve, and some of it may be relatively new. As we have talked about, prior disciplinary actions, as long as there has been some sort of due process, as long as there has been a guarantee that there was a fair and impartial determination made there, all of that information needs to be passed along. It all needs to be available to the next potential hiring agency. And
Can I say something real quick, Kev? So I think where you get Black Americans, people of concern, is when a citizen doesn't get the due process because they're injured because of an offense or an alleged offense, and the outcome goes way south. It would be the community's thought that that law enforcement actor is judge, jury, and executioner on the spot without due process for the citizen.
Right.
When you say due process for the citizen, what are we talking about?
I mean, you should be arrested if that's what you want to do, but when things result in death or maiming or things of that nature on the spot, now again, there's a variety of circumstances that go into that. But I think I would say give due process to law enforcement, but I think citizens would say we shouldn't be DOA or anything like that.
Right.
We should be given our due process, whether it's right or wrong, regardless of the offense as well. And because the lack of due process due to the injuries that occur at the scene, now again, regulating that may be a whole different topic, but I think that's where there's some inconsistency, or at least in my estimation and opinion, the community becomes reactive.
I disagree, because that is already regulated to the nth degree. There are all kinds of standards out there. We have statutory requirements. Law enforcement is allowed to use force under these circumstances right here. There are half a dozen different entities that have jurisdiction to investigate and follow up. Officers are disciplined, suspended, fired, prosecuted on a daily basis if the officers go beyond the scope. Very often even when officers don't get it right, it's not because they are intentionally violating somebody's rights. They simply make mistakes. They come up short. They're human beings. It happens.
In some cases.
I'm gonna say most cases.
No, I'm saying
I'm gonna tell you right now, there's not a single officer out there that expects to go out there and violate anybody's civil rights. That is not what we're wired to do. We are wired to go out and do a job. If I've got a crook that decides they want to fight, guess what? That's on them. Comply now, complain later. I've said that since day one. Comply now, complain later. If you want to complain on me, you think I'm doing something wrong, feel free. But on the side of the road, fighting me? No, that's a problem. I'm going to do what I have to do to go home at night. And that's the way we have to look at it.
I will say this. There are officers, former officers, sitting in prison today across the state of Texas, across the country, because they did things in the course and scope of their duties that were so egregious they deserved to go to prison. It happens. And it happens a lot more often than folks actually realize. However, it is not nearly as prevalent as what I think has become fashionable to claim. And by the way, I want to lead into this by mentioning a case from just this last week. In Irving, they had an individual who was wanted because he had murdered his wife 2 days before, and officers were out looking for him. And when they spotted him, he spotted them, and he then shot himself. They hadn't even approached him yet. He was in a car. They see him. He sees them. He kills himself. That is being treated as an in custody death, officer involved shooting. Okay, that's the way that's being labeled. There are approximately 1,000 individuals who die in contacts with law enforcement on an annual basis. When we start talking about how many of those are justified, how many of them are obviously, cut and dried, without a doubt, the officers behaved rationally. The overwhelming majority of them, the officers did exactly what we expect the officers to do. There's a very small percentage that are in doubt, that are questionable. And then there's a much smaller percentage of those where the officers either misbehaved or broke the law. But it does happen. And I mean, I could cite you a few examples, but the number of cases on an annual basis where officers are killing unarmed individuals without justification is an incredibly small percentage of the 70 million contacts between law enforcement and citizens every year. When you think about it, the number of people who die is a incredibly small number when compared to the 70 million it's like 0.00014% of the
Well,
contact.
I don't think the general public knows there's 70 million contacts. One.
Right.
And I don't think I'm a little bit taken that incident you brought up in Irving, why is that deemed in custody?
I know.
Is that a legal fiction? Is that something that the legislature has passed in law? How did they get to that?
I think we talked about this before, because
Yeah.
Kevin, you gave some examples. Like, for example, if somebody commits suicide while they're in the custody of a police officer, that's going to be considered an in custody death too. So we kind of
Right. But this gentleman wasn't in custody. This person wasn't in custody. They just law enforcement.
But in hopes of complete and total transparency, I think we err on the side of caution. Consider it an officer-involved shooting. Consider it an in-custody death. Have your investigation. Make it open. Here's the circumstances.
I had that exact scenario. I got in a car chase with a guy that was shooting at me. At the end of the chase, we blocked him in, blocked each side of the road. He killed himself in custody death. Why? Because he was not free to get out of that scene. So they considered that an in custody death.
I'll give you another example. After the Enron scandal down in Houston, this was a different agency. It was actually a constable's office in one of the suburbs down there. But one of the individuals involved in that Enron thing was in his car driving in a subdivision in the wee hours of the morning, 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. But he's going very slow through there. So this deputy constable pulls in behind him and is wondering, what is this guy doing? The guy makes a U-turn and goes the other way, so the deputy makes a U-turn. The guy then makes a second U-turn and then stops in the median, in the crossover. So the deputy pulls up there, and the deputy's starting to call out on the radio saying, I'm going to check on this guy. Well, suddenly there's a flash of light inside that automobile. The guy committed suicide. That's considered an in-custody death and an officer-involved shooting. So that it can be thoroughly investigated, and there's a complete transparency about exactly what involvement law enforcement did have. On the other end of that spectrum, we've got the Michael Brown case in Ferguson. We've got the Breonna Taylor case. We've got the Atatiana Jefferson case, where there are huge questions. We grant you, okay, Michael Brown, maybe not so much once it was all said and done, but right up front, you had an eyewitness who was claiming that Michael Brown had his hands up, was surrendering, and he was shot. Turns out that wasn't true, but at least in that moment, there is some reason to question whether or not it was a justified shooting. So it needs to be investigated thoroughly and so on and so forth. Again, most of those cases, it turns out the officers are completely justified. But we have cases like Officer Raja in Florida, the officer in, I believe it was Balch Springs here in Texas, who's now, I think, serving 10 or 15 years in prison.
Yes.
Officer Van Dyke in Chicago, in the Laquan McDonald case, who is serving time in prison. They've moved him a couple of times now, so I'm not sure where he is anymore. But officers go to jail because whether it was intentional or not, whatever action they took was so egregious and so beyond the pall that it's a criminal act. So for folks to say cops are not held accountable, I think is unfair. It is, and I think it's irresponsible. When you look at the details of any given case, and I think Atatiana Jefferson actually is a pretty good case to take a look at, because I don't think anybody questions Atatiana Jefferson wasn't doing anything at all that justified her dying that night. She's in her own home. She is playing video games with her nephew, I believe it was. Okay. She sees what she believes is a prowler outside of her window. She gets a gun. She points it at the prowler. The prowler turns out to be a law enforcement officer. Now, the other side of that is, what is the officer's point of view? What happened there? And I don't have any inside information. This is all public information available to anybody that wants to see it. The officer was not the neighbor had called in a suspicious circumstances because supposedly her door was standing open in the wee hours of the morning, and that didn't seem right. And the neighbor was worried about her safety. It was dispatched over the MDT system as a possible burglary in progress. There was codified. So it wasn't welfare concern. It was a possible burglary in progress. The officers who respond are looking for burglars. They get there, they see a door open. Further evidence there's a felony taking place. One officer goes to the backyard, one goes to the front door. The officer in
Hello?
the backyard looks in, there's a window there, the light.
Froze
and
up a little
woman
bit.
pulls it. I'm sorry?
You froze up a
Froze
little bit.
up a little bit,
Oh,
but that's okay.
Sorry, my internet
going.
interrupted today, but so the officer is looking into the back window and somebody points a gun at him and he fires. Now, whether or not he's justified, whether or not he took, the appropriate steps, that's still being debated and argued. But it is, when you look at it from both points of view, it is not clear cut anymore. It's,
And I think the problem gets in the expertise that you have to look at these cases, or someone such as, someone that's outside doing an investigation, when this information is not what's given out. And I think you've talked about this before, the transparency, being able to have this information so that people have an understanding of what's happening. And so that's part of the issue, which is a totally separate conversation. But like you said, there's no one that's in your view, based on your experience, based on, your role, there's not anyone that intentionally goes out to harm anybody. But then, on the opposite side, that's, in the few cases that we do get to see, that's kind of the narrative. The Tatiana Jefferson is a great case. The Philando Castile case is also a great case. He was just reaching in to get his ID, right? And so when you look at those type of cases, and then you look at how those are handled, and then you talk about due process, of course, you're always going to have a debate on that, because the person that's not there anymore, where's their due process, or they're dead, they don't have it. And that's what Stephen was saying. Whereas you have these officers that get the opportunity to do a full investigation. And I think that having some kind of balancing act there, whether it's getting that information out, like you said, letting it be transparent so that everyone has an open analysis of what's really happened, is going to be the most helpful. Because when you don't have that, all you can do is speculate, and the media will take that opportunity to fill in the blanks.
Oh, yeah.
Y'all are aware of this. I mean, this is not going to be something new, but there's something in the Black community called the talk that all parents give to that regard. Is there a parallel talk that can introduce in a positive way how law enforcement and community can do things better, as opposed to be on guard and you will be okay as a young Black person?
But that's just it. That's just it. It has nothing to do with race. I've had the same conversations with my own son. It's common sense stuff that we need to teach our kids. Don't go out and commit crime. If you commit crime, that's where you're going to get in trouble most of the time. You don't see these people that are getting shot because they're just driving around doing nothing. Most of the people that are engaged or shot by law enforcement are engaged in criminal activity. Yes or no? I mean, that's just a fact. We're not shooting innocent people that aren't doing anything. Outside of the one that you just discussed about the lady in her own home, that's completely different. But for the most part, people that are shot are out committing criminal offenses. And people are, they all of a sudden don't worry about the offense they committed. Allegedly. Okay, there we go with our attorneys. I mean,
that's just the lane we live in, Doug. That's just the lane we live in.
I love it. But that's what I'm saying. I've had that own discussion with my own son. Hey, one, don't get in trouble. But number two, when you get stopped, because guess what? There are officers that are a little more timid or scared than others. And I don't want some rookie mistaking what my son's doing in the car and getting him shot. I know that's the chances of that ever happening are slim to zero. And that should be for everybody. We should never have to have that talk.
Let me say this. I've been in this business 40 years. My entire adult life, I've been in law enforcement. once in a while, not often, once in a while, I tend to have a little bit of a heavy foot and I start going a little too fast.
Oh, way.
I get stopped just once in a blue moon, and it's almost always by DPS. I don't know what the deal is. I think Clay may have a poster in his office that says, "Hey, stop this guy, mess with him when you can."
You get a toaster for the most tickets at the end of the month.
But when I get stopped, especially if it's at night, I pull over at the first opportunity. I turn on my inside dome light. I roll down both windows, okay? And I put my hands on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 position. And I wait for that officer to give me some other instruction. I don't reach for my wallet. I don't reach for the glove box because I don't want that officer to have any reason to be concerned that I am doing something untoward. So yeah, the talk, like Doug says, I think we should have that talk with everybody. We now have it in a curriculum in our high schools. We have it in the driver's handbook that we've talked about. None of us actually reads, but it's out there. I don't know that it's caught on as far as parents. I don't know how many parents actually have that talk with their kids, but we should.
I know
I've
quite
had
a
it
few.
on mine.
And I know we've
By the
had
way,
this
my kids-
conversation. We had this conversation with regards to a couple of sessions ago. Kevin, you led the with Senator Royce West, where we actually did some type of training that they could show in school on
Yeah,
interaction with police officers.
It's actually in the 9th grade curriculum now. It's included in our public school system.
That's good.
By the way, my kids got very tired of me knowing every time they got stopped before they even got home.
Hey, and I'll just echo what both what everybody else has said. I got stopped a few years ago in broad day. I was headed to an Astros game on a Sunday afternoon. Had my wife and a friend of hers in the car. 12 noon, I got stopped in broad daylight, and the individual officer, I won't say what agency he's with, but I'm in a Houston Astros shirt and shorts and flip flops, and I'm old school. I get out of the car and I'm waiting on him because I know he's after me, and he gets out and immediately draws a weapon on me, just simply because I'm out of the car. And of course I put my hands up as quickly as I could, and we had a conversation after that. What are you doing drawing a weapon? His statement was, well, what are you doing getting out of the car? I'm like, well, because I've done that for 30 plus years as a police officer. And then he made a mistake calling me old school, and we had a conversation after that. But I mean, I can't think of anybody less threatening looking than me, especially with a Houston Astros polo and shorts and flip flops on.
Well, that's debatable.
About to say.
Well, but it goes to show, Clay, that the training still, there's something that says you're out the car, I'm going with the weapon.
Absolutely.
That Doug, I mean, Doug, you would be the first guy to go, wait a minute, that's not the way to proceed in this instance. And now, because we've had a tutorial of our own interacting with law enforcement such as yourself, we know who's going to do what in the way, and have your own consternation about how that process went. That goes back to the training, and the training goes back to the dollars. And we know between 2,700 agencies, small to large, we have a variation. Is there any way to get standardization, given the resources are limited, that we can implement something from TCOLE or what have you that just says, good people, we at least need these handful of things regardless? And I think you've mentioned that, but again, between the hiring and what you know as being veterans and the standardization, there's a disconnect with the community.
I think that's where
white, black, whatever ethnicity.
There's a strong disconnect.
I think that's where we're headed, and I think that's part of what this, assuming this bill gets filed and it passes and this blue ribbon panel is created, I think that's the direction we're heading. The key is going to be whether or not there's, the financing can be arranged, but I believe what we're looking at is creating a set of best standards, of best practices, requiring every law enforcement agency in the state of Texas to go through an accreditation process, or continue having a law enforcement agency, and that part of that accreditation will be that they adopt, enact, and enforce policies and training standards that meet with those, best practices. And I think that's the direction we're going. It's going to take some time, and it's going to take a suitcase full of cash.
Yeah.
To make it happen.
Good thing we're in session.
Right.
No, but again, outside of health, the public welfare and safety for a political subdivision that's statewide or even federal, that's, to me, two of the primary things that they're supposed to be responsible for.
Agreed. And there's a reason why 1/2 of any city's budget is going to be their police aid, their law enforcement services, because that is.
And that's why we don't defund them, okay? And that's why we don't defund them. I'm going to be that guy to say that in 2021.
I don't think you're going to be alone, by the way, Steve.
Yeah, right.
Agreed, but I do believe that's where we're headed. I believe that's the direction we're going.
And remember, we can train in tactics. We can train for all kinds of stuff. We can't train common sense. Some people just don't have it, and we have to deal with that. Darling, you know I'm right. You know I'm right.
And that's on both sides of the equation, Doug.
Yes.
That's citizen and law enforcement.
Yeah, I agree.
Here's what we can do, Doug. We can stop trying to eliminate common sense from the job. We can stop adopting policies that are so cumbersome that they tell officers, don't use good old-fashioned common sense. We had a situation, and again, I don't want to, it was in Harris County, but it wasn't Houston, where an officer tased a guy because he refused to stand up, get out of the chair, and do the sobriety test in the video room. So it's on video. It's the part of the DWI arrest that we're supposed to do, where we give the individual an opportunity to do sobriety test on camera, right? The guy refused to get up, and the officer tased him. Why would an officer do that? Was the guy a threat to him? The answer is no. But what the officer remembered from his training was, if somebody refuses your order, if they refuse to do what you tell them to do, you repeat the order. And then you repeat it again a little bit louder, and then a little bit louder. And if they're still not complying, then you threaten to use a taser on them. You threaten to use some sort of intermediate force on them, and you threaten that several times. And then if they still don't comply, tase them. Somewhere in there, somebody during that should have said, by the way, if it happens to be a 6-year-old, ixnay on this, If it happens to be that you're ordering them to comply with something they're not required by law to do anyway, ixnay on there has to be at some point where we say, guys, use some good old fashioned common sense here. And we got
It's not in the training.
Correct. I think it is now.
Training.
I think the training also now includes don't tase somebody that's just doused themselves with gasoline, but guess how we learned that lesson?
Somebody got right. Yeah.
Right.
And I do think training is, like I said, training is one of the recommendations here in this issue on number 3. I think we're all in agreement on training standards. And I think that's a pivotal or, a critical piece of working towards better relationships with the community, whether it's training within the community, training within a police, law enforcement agency. We just need training. Right. And the training needs to be something that can kind of heal and give a little bit more transparency, even to how the policies work. Because I think through having these conversations and having a better understanding of how the policies work, how the investigation takes place, helps even with the community with understanding and giving that time to allow the investigations to take place.
Absolutely. I also think we need to exponentially expand our Citizens Police Academy programs. I think we need to have much more of that. And I think we need to quit having those academies at the police station and start having them out in the communities that we serve. We need to make it so much more easy for folks to come sit in through those classes. And we need to invite people who would otherwise be a little hesitant about coming to a police station for any reason whatsoever. There's a lot, right. And I'm sorry, but there are folks who come from backgrounds, they come from other countries, they come from communities where they simply don't trust law enforcement to start with. And telling them, hey, come down to the police station and we're going to take you into the secured area and teach you a bunch of stuff, they're probably going to say, no, thanks. Let's go do it at the local community center. Let's do it at the Baptist church or the Catholic church or the local mosque or whatever.
And Kevin, if you really want to make this work, you should tell every elected official that one of their town hall meetings, maybe even once a biennium, that's not a lot, it should be annually, has to include at least an open house opportunity where their law enforcement comes together at designated place in their district to come out, meet your elected, understand what goes on, what's the training and the requisites for law enforcement, and then what would be appreciated in the community in the interactions.
Right.
That then is in the, in the
Don't bring
common
Chief
sense.
Osaveda. Don't bring the sheriff, don't bring the constable, bring a line level officer or two and let them have these conversations, and nothing against Chief Osaveda, but I can badmouth him to his face when I see him, but he's a politician. That's what he does. He's an administrator. He's a manager. The conversations need to be happening between the cops and the communities that the cops serve.
Correct.
Period.
Correct. That's right. And you can initiate that because those members have resources. They can send out the bulletins and their newsletters that say, come to said designated place, which is not the law enforcement's, because that's convenient for law enforcement, understood. But again, meet them halfway.
Mhm.
If you truly want your electeds and their electorate to be in a different posture with law enforcement, right?
You'd be
Our
amazed.
police academy is not even good for police officers.
Sorry, Doug, I talked.
Oh, go ahead, buddy.
No, go ahead.
I was just saying, our police academy is not even good for our officers. It's on the far north side of Houston, outside the city limits.
Right.
We're in the middle of nowhere, which is
In the
hard.
middle of nowhere.
But you'd be amazed how difficult it is to get traction with these types of ideas. I don't know of any place. Well, there may be one place other than that is where inertia is stronger than it is in law enforcement, and I think that's in our elected officials.
Right?
But don't, again, we want to say, and it's kind of segueing into next week, we want to talk about the George Floyd Act. Well, dadgum, if there's 180 elected officials in the state of Texas, and we got to have 1921 in the Senate, and I forget what it is, 90 some whatever in the House, 80 some whatever in the House. How can you sit there and vote for an act that you're not willing to host an event that secures your community of voters?
I agree.
Right.
That is the most hypocritical move you could say. And as a former staffer, and as someone who worked in the Criminal Justice Committee as its highest staffer, I would say everything I did to work to get that passed into law would be lip service and look at us, wave the flag, and means absolutely nothing.
If there ever were a time, what's the old expression? If not us, who? If not now, when? If ever there were a time to make something like this happen, now's the time for it.
Yep.
Plain and simple. And I'll charge Rudy. I'll say, Rudy, you need to have Kevin in there. You need to have Kevin, Senator West, and Whitmire, and everybody. Whitmire's white. He's the chair. He knows. He's a lawyer. He knows.
Hey, and I'll give it to Whitmire. He goes and gets in a police car and will go ride like
That's
he did
right.
New Year's Eve. I mean, that I gotta head it to him. At least he'll take that opportunity, go see exactly what we do, see exactly what we have to deal with.
Right.
And I implore anybody that wants to question law enforcement, go do a ride along. Go do a real ride along.
I've done them.
See what it's like. Yes.
And I've done them. I was out at midnight in Lincoln, Nebraska. They had the guns drawn. We were going up to a home. They said, stay behind them. I'm a third-year law student who's in criminal clinic. I did that. That was a live, real deal. Could have gotten shot. Yes.
Hey,
However, I was willing, if I was going to then pass the bar and take the pledge to be on the right side of the scenario, I felt it was my right and duty as someone who is a part of this system and community to have to go through that to ensure that my decisions when I was helping prosecutors as a third-year law student under the direction of a licensed attorney, I wasn't just getting the guys because I felt I didn't like this group, but I like this group, or whatever the case by case was, and my biases would show.
And did y'all just see the way he got excited about that? And the way I could tell his heart was pumping up just from remembering that he was still getting that wired up.
It makes
Go out
sense.
and do it for a living. Even better than doing ride along, go out and do it for a living. Y'all remember after the July 7th of 16, the 5 officers in Dallas that were killed, Chief Brown was being questioned about tactics and so on and so forth. And I loved his response. He said, "We're hiring, come out here and help us. Go through the academy, put on a uniform, and come out here and help us. If you're really going to question our tactics, come out here and show us how to do it right."
Yep.
There's a reason it's called civilian law enforcement. It's made up of civilians. It's made up of our neighbors, of our brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles, and our cops are citizens too.
We don't have special powers.
No, but I will say this: some communities are fragmented.
Hi, Travis.
Agreed.
They don't. Those communities of those folks aren't interacting with other groups. And I tell people all the time, I'm really not afraid of white America because I go into white America every day. But how much of white America comes into Black America every day? You're not racist because you don't come in. You're not biased because you don't come in. Your day may not have that involvement. That's not wrong, but it may not include that involvement. So there may be an unfamiliarity when you're talking about interaction and having these persons do these types of jobs. That's why I think we go back to training, because you have to recognize there's differences amongst groups of ethnicities that make up our community.
And it's a two-way street.
Right.
Yeah. All right. I think we have reached our time limit for the day, guys.
Yes. But I am interested in Doug, great time to say that next week we'll look at the George Floyd Act and how that has been put together in regards to what the state of Texas would look at, because here is something that where rubber's meeting the road. And again, Rudy in his position with the Legislative Black Caucus and us. And I really am going to suggest that Kevin or Clay or yourself be involved, because you do need perspectives. You do need interaction from all of the community to make this work.
Well, we'll see.
Stephen, do I need to send out a copy of that act to everyone
Yes,
so that they'll
please.
have it for
Yes,
next week?
please.
Okay, I'll
Yes,
send that in
please.
an email. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right.
No worries.
So
Y'all have a
we'll
great day.
Rudy next Tuesday. We'll see you guys next Wednesday.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Bye,
I'm gonna
guys.
see you, Doug. I'm gonna catch you. I want to be there.
All right, I'm gonna call you.
Sounds great.
All right, buddy. Y'all
Thank
have a
you.